while kind of punting the decision on who's winners or who's losers down to whether or not you can find a town that'll give you that local approval. And that's been the big fight, right? And I think it's kind of like
Right.
an unintended consequence in the sense that, as we talked about, the state wants to prioritize these folks, especially those who aren't the millionaires, who don't make, the top salaries in the state. Meanwhile, they've created a two-system process where you have to spend money on your state application, and separately, and more, and it's increasingly the case, you need to spend a lot of money on a local application first, right? Because many towns have said, well, if we only allow one or two licenses, we should create a local application process. Maybe that's similar to the state application process, so we can try and figure out who to pick and choose, right? And that's kind of been the really remarkable turn, which is, again, I think all of this was kind of well intentioned and a way to let more people into the industry beyond just incumbents. But nevertheless, it's kind of created these multiple ripple effects of complexity, and that are still playing out. And I'll give you a perfect example. There's a great client that I've been working with for years who have just been waiting for an application round, especially while that medical round was tied up in litigation. Woman-owned business, self-financed, two great people and individuals. They had a town that they were focused on. They worked with that town for months. They appeared at town council meetings. They met with people in the community. They listened to their concerns. And sure enough, when that town opted into adult use, they were one of the first businesses in the state of New Jersey to get a local approval. Sure enough, what happened? They've already been brought into one lawsuit, and they were lucky enough to win that lawsuit. The judge
Okay.
recognized that everything the town did was proper. They're not being threatened with a second lawsuit, right? And so it's just this whole thing,
Oh,
right? And again, I think, as I said earlier, I think one of the goals of the state was to try and avoid lawsuits, right? But the reality is, no matter where you kind of push or shift responsibility for the ultimate determination of who wins or loses a license, it's inevitably going to result in lawsuits. So, as I always say to folks, the only sure things in life
yeah.
are, death, taxes, and cannabis lawsuits. And unfortunately, we're still seeing those lawsuits play out. And I think more will be coming down the pipe.
My goodness. And it's just everything that's happening with New Jersey at the local level is very similar to California as well. It's like deja vu all over again in another state. And one thing that I heard, I didn't exactly experience this directly with any of my clients, but what I heard was at the local level, let's say that municipality says, I'm going to allow for two retail storefronts, and they're only allowed to give approval to two retail storefronts. They can't give approval to, let's say, 10 retail storefronts and then wait it out at the state level to see who gets licensed first at the state level, which I thought was like, I mean, I guess that is opening yourself up for lawsuits if you do the latter. But I was just like, wow, like what happens if you do give approval and then they don't pass their state application at first? They have a deficiency and then they have to go back through. Like all of it is just so complicated. So with that being said, the licensing deficiencies, what are the most common mistakes that you're
And
seeing
by the way,
right now?
just to your last point, real quick, before I get to that one, hundred. Well, so
Yeah.
what you said is absolutely true. That a town should not be giving more resolutions than they have licenses available. Not every town knew that or understood that, right? So, like,
Oh my
just, I mean,
goodness.
again, now we're in kind of like the second incantation of licensing. We're on the retail side. Cultivation and manufacturing opened up in December 15th. A lot of these towns only passed their local ordinances, August 21st or around that time, right? And everyone was still figuring out. So there were some towns that gave out more resolutions than they had available licenses under the cap, which, going back to, this priority structure, made it so hypercritical to say, well, can I structure my business in a way that gets me to a higher priority? Or what does that mean for
Right.
for the other competition in this town? And really, like, for the first several months of legalization and the build up to licensing, it created all these strategies of trying to figure out, again, how not to lose your investment, right? Like, you've sunk these resources in the state application, you've sunk these resources into a local process, and everyone's feeling it out and figuring it out for the first time, which gets back to your question on the deficiencies, right? And deficiencies, is like this, is the stick in your spokes as you're trying to get to licensure. Because at the very least, even for conditional licensure, assuming no deficiencies, it takes 90 to 120 days just to get to that point. Now, the CRC has a huge, bundle of applicants. I think as of last week, there's been 900 total applications submitted across all classes, right?
Wow.
And they're doing their best to really move through these piles. And you give them credit because, I think over the first 4 months, they did issue about 101 licenses, conditional licenses, right? So smaller application packet, but nevertheless. But I think one of the other ways, candidly, that they've tried to manage the pile, so to speak, is to use the deficiency process, right? So in New Jersey, there's a 3-phase review process, right? The first review is on priority status, right? They pick up your application. I mean, it's in the portal, but they're picking up the application and they say, okay, well, you self-designate in the portal as a social equity business. Let me see what you've submitted to prove to me that you're a social equity business. And I should add, the whole social equity process has been confusing for a lot of folks who haven't kind of triangulated what the requirements are, right? Because if you're going off of a cannabis conviction, one of the kind of like unfortunate catch-22s about cannabis arrests and cannabis convictions, especially as they relate to licensure, is if you've been arrested over probably the last 15 to 20 years for anything cannabis related, more often than not, a lot of these states, instead of convicting you, put you through what we call in New Jersey like a pretrial intervention program, where they say, we're going to stay your charges, we're going to stay your conviction, as long as you go through either drug court or do community service or something like that. As long as you go through what we're telling you to go through, we'll wipe away that conviction, right? And like what's unfortunate about that is it doesn't take away the trauma of the underlying arrest or going through the criminal justice program. So I've had so many people come to me and say, we're building on our team. We have a trusted partner who has a cannabis related conviction. And I always say, I say, look, this isn't to give anyone a hard time, but you got to ask the questions. Can you present to me the paperwork of your conviction itself? And more often than not, when they press their colleagues on that, it more often than not, it comes out that it was a pretrial intervention, not an actual conviction, right? And so that's something that at the priority stage, if that were the case with the documents submitted, the CRC would punt it back to you and say, this isn't adequate proof. If you have something else, upload. If not, your options are kind of to withdraw your application, submit again, and then again, get behind whatever your priority bucket is. Same thing with diversely owned, right? I mean, for diversely owned businesses, it's 51% owned and controlled by either a minority or a woman, or in the case of a veteran-owned business, a disabled veteran, right? Now, it's not just having that, right? You have to get the certification from the Department of Treasury that actually certifies you as that. So a lot of folks will just upload their operating agreement and say, I'm 51% owned and controlled by females, right? And you'll get a deficiency letter on that saying, hey, give me your certification. If you don't have it and you can't get it, they're going to have to reject your application. You go back to the end of the line.
And that certification can take weeks to get to, right?
Yeah, and to Department of Treasury's credit, they recognize how competitive the application process is in New Jersey, and they do their best, within their abilities to expedite the review of those. But yes, if you call up Treasury today and ask for an estimate, they'll tell you it takes 4 to 6 weeks to review those applications, right? So it's difficult.
Wow.
So that's your first level review, which is just looking at priority. Now you've gotten through first level review. Now you're on second level review. Have you submitted all mandatory documents required, right? So like if you're doing a conditional license, right? For all of your persons of interest, in addition to the I think it's like a 16-page personal history disclosure form, have you submitted all those? For all your persons of interest, did they give their last year's tax returns? And not just their last year's tax returns, but their last year's state and federal tax returns, right? So I see a common deficiency that people get hit with when they've uploaded the federal, but they haven't uploaded their state tax return as well, right? The worst, the most egregious deficiency that I've seen, and I feel so bad for the applicant, is on government issued IDs, right? So you have to provide government issued IDs for all persons of interest. I knew somebody who had a government issued ID. They submitted their application on December 15th. The reviewer did not review their application until, let's call it February 1st. On January 28th, their IDs that they submitted on December 15th expired. They got a deficiency letter saying you need to update a current government issued ID, not an expired one. And note, after you submit your application, you can't change it, right? So like completely out of the applicant's control. Like they, there's nothing they can do to change that, right? Um, but it's just kind of a
My
sampling that
goodness.
you never know what reviewer you're going to get. But it's important to kind of like know
Hmm.
the types of things that come out and see what can come up from that. But again, the mandatory documents thing I think is the most difficult because as most practitioners will tell you, the disclosure requirements for New Jersey, especially on the front end of an application, may be the most onerous nationally. And this becomes difficult, especially for applicants who are soliciting funding with lenders, right? Because it's one thing for a lender to say, hey,
Hmm.
look, I'm going to commit to give you whatever it is, $2 million once you get your final license that I'm going to give it to you under a loan and that's great. And you're so lucky because access to capital is the most difficult thing in the industry. You're so lucky to get that. And then the applicant comes back to the lender and says, hey, by the way, I need your entity that's lending this to me to fill out this 38-page entity disclosure form. I need all of the owners of your lending vehicle to complete these personal history disclosure forms that also requires those owners to give us your tax returns, both state and federal, and all this other information. And if you're a lender who's unaccustomed to New Jersey, you look around saying, you're running me through the ringer when I'm the one giving you $2 million, right? So it's like
Right.
and again, we're just at completeness review. We haven't even gotten to on the documents. We haven't even gotten to the substantive review, and that's the third bucket of application review, which is have you uploaded all of the other required documents, right? Which is have you uploaded your regulatory compliance plan, your business plan, your plan to obtain liability insurance, and then anything else you check in the portal, right? Like so New Jersey is a portal-based application, right? And it's relatively speaking user-friendly, although it's got a lot of bugs to it. One page is a list of I think it's 15 to 20 questions that are you check either yes or you check no, right? And I always call that like the unintended consequence list, right? Because there's questions in there such as, do you intend to enter into a partnership with a reentry program? And I would tell you 99% of applicants say that's a good cause for me to get involved in. You know what? I do intend on entering into a reentry program once I'm licensed. I check yes. Now, if you don't have a partnership with a reentry program that you already have on paper that you've uploaded into the documents pane, that's another area that could get flagged as a deficiency for you, right? So it's just like all these learning
Yep.
curves, all these methods to kind of handle the pile, all these potential hurdles. And again, every time you hit a deficiency, you're then paused where you are in the process, and anyone else who's ahead of you continues to jump you, right? So it's just like this is and candidly, that's the hardest part to kind of communicate with clients. It's just like it's like the guy who's like juggling plates, right? I mean that's how the New Jersey application process works, and it's in a process where folks are spending money, where you're kind of looking for as much predictability as possible, candidly, the best that you can do is just, work with professionals.